Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and days of old lang syne? For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll talk of kindness yet for days of old lang syne. And here's a hemlock, trusty friend, and here's a hand of mine. We'll talk a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne. We'll talk a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne.
Oops. A little much. Maybe 2 teaspoons. Okay. And 1/2 teaspoon of cloves.
Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and days of old lang syne? For old lang syne, dear, for old lang syne, we'll talk a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. For old lang syne.
Eight ounces cream cheese, 1/4 cup of butter, 2 cups of powdered sugar, and a teaspoonful of real vanilla blended together. I beat this till it was nice and creamy, but I also added about 1/4 cup of half and half, and that was so that I can drizzle this over the top of the cake. I have doubled this recipe, but I'm going to give you the recipe to make 4 of these meat pies. You'll need 4 slices of bacon, roughly chopped, 3 garlic cloves minced, 1 large onion, finely chopped, 8 brown mushrooms, finely chopped, half a cup of dry white wine or apple cider vinegar will work. The spices that you're going to put in here are going to be 1 teaspoon salt, half a teaspoon pepper, half a teaspoon cinnamon, 1/8 teaspoon both ground cloves and ground nutmeg. I'm going to be using 2 tablespoons of maple syrup, 1 pound of ground pork, and a half a pound of ground beef. Now right now I have let this mixture saute here, the bacon, the onions, the garlic, and the mushrooms. I'm going to go right ahead and add those spices right now and let this get really fragrant. Oh yes, now I can smell it. Look at the meat. When the meat is no longer pink, you can add your grated potatoes and your maple syrup. When those potatoes are nice and tender, you can begin to let this cool off, and then we're going to prepare the pastries that this is going to go in. Any pie crust dough will work for your meat pies. I'm also using these spring pans. That's because the Victorians would have formed these pies by hand, but I want mine to look really pretty, so I'm going to use these because it's easy. I've cut some 2-inch strips to go along the edge of the little pan here. I've got the bottoms and the tops will be exactly the same. Then I will do some decorative leaves for the top. The edges where the side of the dough meets the bottom. Okay, when your meat mixture is cooled off, you can fill up these pies. You will have preheated your oven to 400. You're going to cook these in the oven for 10 minutes at 400, and then you're going to take the heat down to 375 and bake them for about 30 minutes until they're nice and brown. This mixture actually makes 4 meat pies. Well, let's hope that these turn out as beautiful as they are before they're cooked. Now what I do is I will cover these with some foil and till the very last 10 or 15 minutes, just because I don't want those little ornaments and the top crust to burn, but just keep a close eye on this. We are going to have a Victorian Dickens brunch. This is a very simple affair. It's great for a New Year's brunch. It serves 4 people, but we're actually only having 2 at this particular meal. And the foods that I prepared are foods that would have been eaten during the Victorian times. They're actually very simple foods. Aside from the meat pie, everything was really pretty easy to make. We have soups, we have fruits, and we have a very beautiful gingerbread cake over here with cream cheese dressing. We have cider to drink, mulled cider, and hot chocolate. Because I think that wintertime is such a wonderful time to be reading Dickens books, I wanted to do this Dickens brunch, and I want to use my old curiosity shop plates because the Old Curiosity Shop was written by Charles Dickens, and because I love these plates. I used these once before in another video. Tea with Charles Dickens, I believe it was. Dinnerware is from the 1950s, and it was made in USA, and these were plates that you could get by turning in your stamps, your green stamps or your gold stamps, in your little stamp book that you would collect at the grocery store. And that's how you could collect the platters, the plates, the teacups, and everything else that goes with it. If you want a refresher course on these plates, go look at my video called Tea with Charles Dickens. Each of the images on the plates and the cups and the saucers are some from one of the stories in the Old Curiosity Shop, or something reminiscent of what you would find in an old antique shop from around 1840. These actually are pretty easy to find still. I used to see them all the time in thrift shops and antique stores, and I didn't know what they were. I just thought they were kind of strange looking. But I simply love the images here of Old England. Now, one thing I've not gotten are the bowls, so I had to make do, but I like these little bean pot bowls, because even though they're not exactly the same color, I think this aqua sort of a green really sets off the other plates. Thing has to match and be perfect, especially at something casual like what we're having here today. This is not really a bowl. It's actually a pudding mold, an old pudding mold, but it makes a marvelous bowl for my spiced peaches. So, like I said, the setting is pretty simple. I'm using 2 copper heaters here. I've got mulled cider in the big copper dispenser there, and hot chocolate is going into the little chocolate pot. We will drink tea later if we want to. Probably not, because it's James and I. He's not a tea drinker. So I am so proud of this meat pie. Isn't it beautiful? I'm very proud of that little meat pie. Put it right here. Okay, the menu are the beef, pork, meat pies. We have a broccoli cheese soup. We have mulled cider and hot chocolate, and we also have tea. We have a gingerbread cake with cream cheese icing. Peaches, these are from the peaches that I grew and canned this summer. We have butternut squash soup. I made a lot of that and I froze it. And we have cranberry orange relish. Now all of these dishes are things I would assume would have been served in Victorian times. Well, it's a very meager feast, but it's really very healthy and it looks really delicious. So let's give everything a try. I'm especially anxious to try the meat pies. Now, this is the second time I made the meat pies, and so I changed the recipe a little bit, and I'll explain that to you when I cut open that pie. Now, I made these on Christmas. I made these on Christmas Day as well. But then I changed the recipe this time because I found that instead of using just pork, don't do that. It's just too dry. I exchanged that this time around. I exchanged it. In place of the ground pork, I would use ground sausage. I would use ground sausage or even breakfast sausage or Italian sausage. You just need that extra flavor. The ground pork just didn't have enough flavor. I would also omit the wine, white wine, or if you had to replace it like I did with cider vinegar, don't put it in because it just overpowers this mixture and that's all you taste is cider vinegar. That was really not good. Also, I added another quart cup of green chopped onions and I added another about 6 or 7 slices of bacon chopped up and it really improved the flavor. This is really delicious now. On Christmas Day, it didn't taste like this. This is really good. The crust is flaky. My little meat pie stayed together. Oh, it's so pretty. I almost hate to cut into it, but meat pies were pretty much a staple in the Victorian times, and in the colonial times as well, and in the medieval times. Meat pies were very, very popular. As far as having fruit on the table, if you were well off, you could probably have some fresh fruit. Gingerbread was pretty much a universal thing. That's an awfully big gingerbread cake for just 2 people, but we'll just probably cut a lot of it up and just freeze it in pieces. The reason I did the cheese and broccoli soup is because I learned by watching the Charles Dickens Museum that the Dickens family loved melted cheese. In fact, they had melted cheese almost after every meal. But one thing I could not find in my search was a Victorian cheese toaster. So instead, I made this as a replacement. It's a delicious recipe. I'll put it below. It's simply mostly cheese, but I've also got carrots, broccoli, and some cauliflower in here. And possibly the Victorians would have had access to them at this time of the year. I'm not sure. But most likely they would if they had greenhouses and they had a little bit of money. But of course the Dickenses had a lot of money because Charles Dickens became very, very successful with his books. Pretty little pie and really very filling. So I'll probably be able to eat about a quarter of it and then save the rest for another meal because it's really, really very filling. I've also invited our little mouse actresses who were featured in our last presentation, which was the Tale of Gloucester. Gloucester, you see, I got it right this time. I must have said Gloucester 20 times. And some people did not like that, but I did not know how to pronounce it properly. So, maybe next time. Anyway, these little gals, they don't eat much, and I sure appreciate all their help. This recipe is a true Victorian gingerbread recipe, so it's very, very strong, and it is, obviously, as you saw, I used black molasses in it. So it's pretty strong gingerbread. I think the cream icing really helps ease it down a little bit. And it's topped with raspberries and sprigs of rosemary. If you love gingerbread, you will really like that cake. It's very, very dense. It's very, very strong. And it's very, very dry. So you might want to really increase that icing or that frosting, or even drizzle some on top of your slice. This is a huge bundt pan that I had, so this cake is far too much cake that I will ever need, and probably the donkeys will get quite a bit of that cake. They would really like that. But, as I said, this is a Charles Dickens theme here, and that's because I love to read Charles Dickens books in the winter. Something about Charles Dickens and winter just is very appealing to me. And I think he is probably my favorite author of all time. So I thought it would be interesting to tell you a few facts that I dug up about Charles Dickens. Dickens was the most popular novelist of the century. His books have never, ever been out of print. And I like this quote that I read. From his book, Hard Times, the beginning was, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And Charles Dickens wrote it all down. And that is really what you'll find in his books. Everything that was gruesome, possibly gruesome truths about Victorian England are all in his books. The best of times and the worst of times. As I tell you a bit about Charles Dickens from the notes that I took, I'll probably flip through a couple of these old Dickens books that I own. A lot of these are early copies. And you'll be able to see a few of these fine illustrations. He was born in 1812 and he had 7 brothers and sisters. However, his father had amassed so much debt that the entire Dickens family, all except for Charles Dickens and his sister Fanny, were sent to a debtor's prison. It was the Marshalsea debtor's prison, and it appears in the book Little Dorrit. This is where Little Dorrit and her family live, in the Marshalsea debtor's prison, all except for her older brother and her sister Fanny. So Charles obviously used his sister's name in this book, and he had a lot of experience with the life in a debtor's prison. Understand the concept of a debtor's prison. How can you pay off your debt when you're locked in a prison? And who pays for the food? I mean, you have to be clothed, and these places have to be kept up. So I really do not understand the debtor's prison deal. But Charles was forced to take work at the age of 12. At the young age of 12, Charles Dickens got a job, because he was pretty much on his own, at Warren's blacking warehouse, where he earned 6 shillings a week, pasting labels on shoe polish blacking pots. He did that until he was 15 years old, where he finally got a job as a junior clerk at a law office. But instead of practicing law, he actually learned shorthand. It was a new method of writing, and it was through this shorthand that he learned how to write, and he began working as a reporter in 1830. His first published works were under the pseudonym Boz, B-O-Z, between 1833 and 1834, and he was writing for periodicals, and they would be different chapters of stories. That would include The Old Curiosity Shop. It wasn't originally published as a novel like this. It was published in different chapters once a week. And the public was so enthralled with these stories because he would always leave you with a cliffhanger at the end of a chapter. And everybody was so enthralled that on the docks of New York, when they were waiting for the new publication to come in on The Old Curiosity Shop, they were waiting at the shore to find out for the last chapter of the book if Nell died, the character Little Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop. So Charles Dickens was quite the star in America. Now, it didn't start out that way, but eventually he became very, very wealthy. But originally, Charles Dickens wanted to be an actor, but he missed out on his first audition because he had a cold. Despite America's love for Charles Dickens had no great love for America. When he visited America, he was just absolutely surrounded by crowds, actually mobs of fans, and they just simply wouldn't leave him alone. He said he couldn't go around a corner without hordes of people just bothering him and wanting his autograph and praising him, which, you know, most people might like, but he didn't really care for that. But I think what he disliked most of anything is what he said about the bad habit of chewing and spitting tobacco that Americans had. Well, I don't know about many Americans having that habit, but apparently that is something that he picked up on. As I said, Charles Dickens published 15 novels and hundreds of short stories and many novellas. Nicholas Nickleby, this is one, 1843. It's not one of my favorites, but to have a copy this old is pretty special. I think Dickens had a heart for animals. He had pet ravens, and one of his ravens' name was Grip. He was very, very fond of Grip. And when Grip died, he replaced Grip with another raven, which he also named Grip. When that one died, he had him stuffed. And I believe he is in a museum in Philadelphia inside of a glass box to this day. In Dickens' story Barnaby Rudge, he actually featured his raven Grip. And that inspired the other famous author, Edgar Allan Poe, to write The Raven. His poem was actually inspired by the raven in Dickens' story, according to his biographer. He's also quite fond of cats. He said, "What greater gift than the love of a cat?" In 1862, he had a cat's paw stuffed and mounted to an ivory letter opener. Obviously, one of his favored cats. Dickens really had a place in his heart for the poor and the downtrodden, and that's probably because of the childhood that he had and the way he had to fend for himself. And the Victorian times were not all the romance that we like to make them. They were pretty tough times, especially in London. Life was really tough and really bad for a lot of people. And Charles Dickens showed, as we said in the beginning, the best and the worst of times and the best and the worst of people. Dickens also started a rehabilitation home for homeless women, women of the streets, women who had been orphaned, all kinds of women who had been abused, and I think that's a pretty was a pretty noble cause, especially back in those hard times. Most everyone is familiar with one of his most famous stories, A Christmas Carol, but Charles Dickens actually wrote several Christmas stories that many of us are not even aware of. One of them was The Cricket on the Hearth. I think another one was called The Chimes. I'm actually not really that familiar with his other Christmas stories, and I have not read all of his books, but I do have my favorites, of which I have read, that I would recommend to anybody. One of the first novels I ever read was Great Expectations. I think that's when I really began to love the work of Charles Dickens, because his characters are always so rich. His stories are complicated. There's so many twists and turns. There's so many mysteries. There's so many eccentric characters. They're just always fascinating, and the names that he would give his characters were always so absolutely wonderful. Oliver Twist, Martin Chuzzlewit, Jenny Wren, all great names. Now, I'd like to just tell you what my favorite Dickens books are. I have not read all Dickens books, not by a long shot, but my very, very favorites are Our Mutual Friend and Bleak House. Bleak House is a pretty huge novel and very involved, but I love both Our Mutual Friend and Bleak House. And Our Mutual Friend was nearly lost due to a train accident. He was working on a manuscript. A train went off the tracks, something to that effect. The train, he was trying to help people, he was trying to rescue some people, and his manuscript was nearly lost. Thank goodness it wasn't, because I love Our Mutual Friend. It has one of my favorite characters in it, and that would be Jenny Wren, the little doll maker. Same as reading a book, but there have been an awful lot of really good movie renditions put out on Charles Dickens stories. I don't know how many times Great Expectations has been made into a movie, but most of them have been pretty good. Years ago, a production was put together called Dickensian, and it wasn't written by Charles Dickens, but it includes all the characters, many, many characters from several of his books. Books such as Our Mutual Friend, Bleak House, Great Expectations, and Oliver Twist. Those characters that appeared in those stories appear in this one story, and they're all blended together in several episodes, and it kind of ties up a lot of loose ends and answers a lot of questions that Dickens did not address in his novels. And I'd say that, considering the fact that Charles Dickens didn't actually write this series, it was really pretty good. I enjoyed that a lot. That was Dickensian. He was married to Catherine, called Kate. They had 10 children together. She also was a writer. She wrote books on domestic management and cooking. It seemed that at the very beginning they were very, very much in love, but as time went on and he became more famous, he became impatient with the children, and things didn't go so well after a while. Eventually they were separated and divorced, and he did remarry another woman later on in life. Charles Dickens died of a stroke in 1870, but he certainly left behind a great volume of wonderful works and wonderful characters that will live on and on and on throughout the ages, I think. Do you have a favorite Charles Dickens novel, or do you even like Charles Dickens at all? Let us know in the comments. I think it'd be pretty interesting to know. In the meantime, the little mice and I say goodbye, and we will see you next time in Hopalong Hollow. Oh, this little mouse wanted me to tell you that Charles Dickens had a secret door in his house disguised as a bookcase, of course, of all things. I wonder what it led to. Who knows? Well, she knows, because she knows all the secret places.